dass mir keiner über die Stange schlägt.
The term martial arts is today mostly associated with its Asian variants, for example karate, taekwondo, or with regard to sword fighting, kendo comes into mind. Only a few people are aware of the rich European tradition of martial arts. The so-called Gudrunlied, which is dated around 1230, mentions 4 Schirmschläge or fencing strikes. Other sources, like for example the Nibelungenlied, indicate that there were masters that systematically taught the art of fighting. The oldest instructional manual of a European fighting art dates to the end of the 13th or the beginning of the 14th century. It demonstrates the use of sword and buckler. Remarkably, throughout the book, clerics are shown fencing, so we can clearly see that fighting monks were not a privilege of the Shaolin monasteries in China. The following period in time, up until the 16th century, produced over 50 German manuscripts dealing with fencing. In later times, the invention of printing dramatically increased the number of available fencing manuals. The term fencing, or in German Fechten, at this time included the whole repertoire of armed and unarmed combat. If you compare the German term Fechten with the English term fighting, you can clearly see the word relationship between the two. In the period of time covered in this work, not only the use of the sword was taught, there was also instruction in the use of spears and halberds, daggers, and also in the art of wrestling. A German accounts book from 1474 is the first evidence of a regulated organization of fencing masters. The Brotherhood of Our Beloved Woman, the Pure Virgin Mary, and the Holy and Powerful Duke of Heaven, Saint Mark, or short, Marksbrüder, was organized like the craftsmen's guilds. Most members of the Marksbrüder were craftsmen. The society was even granted its own coat of arms. In the year 1487, Emperor Friedrich III granted a letter of privilege to the Marksbrüder. He allowed only members of their society to offer paid instruction in fencing. The seat of brotherhood was located in Frankfurt, where once a year the examination for the degree of master was conducted. The Marxbruder had an extraordinary monopoly, which many of today's martial arts organizations would be very glad to have. In the year 1570, an important competitor organization named Society of the Feather at Greifenfels introduced its coat of arms. In 1607, Emperor Rudolf II granted them their own letter of privilege. In old documents, they were often called Federfechter. The most important weapon detailed in the surviving German fencing manuals is definitely the hand and a half or the longsword. In the year 1389, we can find the first written evidence of a fencing master who shaped the way of fighting with this weapon for a very long time. His name was Johannes Lichtenauer. He formulated a pragmatic martial art around the use of the longsword. His method included fighting in armor, as well as on foot, as on horseback. Lichtenauer concealed his art by writing in verse. This was a common method of preserving information in a time when only a few people could read and write. There is no surviving manual written by the master himself. Luckily, many of his followers wrote down his verses together with short explanations to them, the so-called Glosse. Even Master Talhofer, who is nowadays very famous in reenactment circles, founded his art on the basis of Lichtenauer's method. Very little is known about the life of Lichtenauer. His name would indicate a relationship to a place called Lichtenau. Unfortunately, there were many places with this or a similar name in the times. One probable theory points to a place called Lichtenau in the area of today's Poland. The so-called Derbringer manuscript indicates that Lichtenauer was a traveling fencing master who learned his art from many masters in different countries before systemizing it for himself and his students. The longsword consists of the hilt and the blade. The hilt consists of the pommel, the grip, and the crossguard or simply cross. The blade is divided into the long edge, the short edge, and the point. One can subdivide the blade into weak and strong. The strong is the first half of the blade from the cross to the middle. The remaining half from the middle to the point is called weak. This simple test is better than a myriad of words to explain the meaning of weak and strong. Let your partner hold a sword in front of him. Tell him to grip it as tight as he's able to. If you now try to push the sword at the strong part of the blade, it will not be easy to do. However, if you push on the weak part, you only need a small amount of force to move it away. To reconstruct the longsword techniques on this DVD, we use mainly 5 fencing manuals which all explain the teachings of Lichtenauer. Even though the authorship isn't always clear, 4 of these books are attributed to the masters Peter von Danzig, Hans von Speyer, Jud Lev, and Sigmund Ringeck. The remaining anonymous manual is generally known under the title Goliath. As secondary sources, we use the fencing manual of Joachim Meyer and the house book, which is generally attributed to the priest Hanko Derbringer. Just a last word regarding this work. Every reconstruction of a historical fighting art can only represent the present state of research. Even though we can be sure about the principles of the art thanks to the many sources, it's possible that new sources we may find in the future will offer different points of view on certain aspects. The distance between 2 fences can, for teaching reasons, be divided up in different ways. The following division has worked quite well for us. Standing in wide distance means you have to take an adjustment step to be able to attack with a simple step. Being in middle distance means you can attack the opponent with a simple step. At near or close distance, you can attack your opponent without taking a step. At close distance, you're close enough to use grips and wrestling techniques. The expression blade in line means that the weapon is aligned with the target in a straight line and thus threatens an opening. By closing the line, one removes the threat of the opposing weapon from the opening. Vor and nach designate the concept of Lichtenauer to always seize the initiative or to regain it if necessary. To be in the state of vor, or before in English, means to force your opponent to react and to defend himself instead of attacking you. Thus it's better to attack directly or spoil the preparation of the opposing attack than wait for the opponent's actions. If you're in the state of nach, or after, through an early action of your opponent, you can regain the initiative through an action that happens in this, or at the same time. The term indis is also closely related to fühlen or feeling. The concept of feeling is also very important in Master Lichtenauer's art. As soon as a bind happens during a fight, one should try to judge the opponent's intentions through the pressure he's putting on your blade. Thus you can determine the appropriate techniques even without having to look, by simply relying on perception. As it is still practiced in modern fencing, Master Lichtenauer divided the man into 4 openings. Contrary to the modern concept of openings, where the openings move with the weapon, the old openings were divided by a horizontal and a vertical line crossing nearly at solar plexus height. Since the techniques shown in this video contain many techniques directed towards the face, it's essential to wear a fencing mask during practice. Padded gloves, like those used in street hockey or ice hockey, are essential for many exercises. As practice weapons for beginners, we recommend swords made from wood, preferably hickory or beech. Recently, hardened aluminium as a material for training swords has become more and more acceptable. Steel swords are not immediately necessary at the beginning. Of course, one shouldn't take part in exercises with sharp swords. If you decide on a blunt steel sword, you should pay close attention to the data for the ranges of application the manufacturer intended. However, it's important that the sword selected is not too heavy in order to correspond, at least to some extent, to the balance and feel of originals. The weight of an average 1.5-handed sword should be approximately 1.5 kilograms or 2.75 pounds. For free fencing, modified shinais from kendo are also used when equipped with a cross. Here you can see some practice weapons for the diverse branches of our art. First, the long sword as a basis for all kinds of weapons. Then the staff, the one-handed sword, mostly used together with a small shield or buckler, the long knife and the dagger. In a good stance, you have to accomplish two different things, balance and mobility. In our basic stance, the front foot points to the opponent and the back foot is angled 45 to 90 degrees to the side. The body is upright or slightly leaning to the front. Avoid standing so high that you could easily be pushed off balance, and don't stand so low that you cannot move quickly in every direction. The weight should be distributed equally between both feet. On some occasions, for instance in fencing with the rapier, it's possible to shift the weight more forward or backwards. The so-called simple step is the first and easiest piece of footwork in historic sword fighting. As the name suggests, one foot is simply placed in front of the other, just like normal walking. In the case of the double step, you first make a simple step angle to the side. The other foot is then moved behind so that the body is facing your opponent once again. It goes without saying that this movement can also be carried out in a backward direction. In the case of the sliding step, the foot pointing in the direction of the proposed movement is moved first, and the other foot follows suit so that a basic position is adopted again. The sliding step can be used forwards and backwards, as well as to the left or right. The so-called Nachstellschritt, or adjustment step, functions in exactly the opposite way to the sliding step. The movement is first shortened and then extended. The cross step, for its part, is seldom used apart from certain techniques in fighting with the Messer. Although only one side is shown here, naturally it can be carried out on the left or the right. The forward lunge involves a sudden movement of the rear leg which catapults the body forward over a long distance. The rear foot remains in its original position. In certain cases, the lunge can also be carried out in a backward direction, hence the name backward lunge. This exercise not only offers footwork training, but also improves the feeling for distance. One partner takes the lead in which he carries out sliding steps in all four directions. The other partner attempts to follow this as directly as possible while keeping the same distance. In German fencing documentation dating back to the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, a sword is gripped in two ways. The first variation is familiar to everyone and is thus called the standard grip. In the other version, the sword is held so that the thumb is placed on the blade and the edges are to the side. Due to a lack of an historic term to cover this, we would like to call it the thumb grip. In order to practice the technique shown in this film, you have to be able to change over from one type of grip to the other in a fluid way. Here we can see that the left hand is responsible for power generation, whereby the sword's grip is used for leverage, with the right hand taking the lead. These are the basic angles of attack that can be applied with every weapon. Line A to E shows the direction of a straight Oberhau. Line B to F and H to D denotes the diagonal Oberhau. C to G and G to C shows the Mittelhau, while D to H and F to B denote the right and left Unterhau. The rarely used straight Unterhau is shown by line E to A. This is a basic striking exercise that teaches the above-mentioned angles of attack in a fixed sequence. You can strike a right diagonal Oberhau and then a left Unterhau, then a right Unterhau and a left Oberhau. Afterwards, a right Mittelhau followed by a left Mittelhau. You conclude with a straight Oberhau and a straight Unterhau. If the sequence is done with the long sword, it's very important that you use simple steps or double steps as described earlier. In this exercise, one partner holds a stick with both hands and offers his opponent this as a target to attack. First, the partner, using a stick, holds it in a neutral position in front of his body and moves freely about. The other attempts to keep a suitable distance, which would enable him to attack with a step forward. When the opponent holds the stick to the side, then the attacker must be able to react and respond with a suitable strike. Just a little tip at this point, the person holding the stick is best advised to wear protective gloves. Here we see an exercise which is designed to practice the four most important thrusts. The exact way that this should be carried out is discussed later in the chapter dealing with the long sword basics. Just as in the case of strikes, you can also practice thrusts with the aid of a partner holding a target. First, the target is held in a neutral position at chest height and suddenly brought into a thrust position. The partner has to respond immediately with a suitable responsive thrust. The foundations of fencing with the long sword are the guards and the strikes. Guards are positions to await the opponent's attack, as well as starting and ending points of certain strikes or techniques. Lichtenauer advises against lying too long in a single guard position. It seems he favoured moving constantly from one guard to the other. From tug on the shoulder. Translated, this means from the day or from the roof. It forms an ideal starting point for a diagonal cut. In the right version of this guard, the sword is held at the right shoulder, the blade pointing about 45 degrees backwards. The left foot is in front. To adopt the left version of this guard, simply reverse the right one. Because of the hands being crossed, attacks from this guard are weaker than from the right version. Vom Tag, over the head, is perfectly suited to deliver a straight attack from above. In this guard, the only difference of the right and left versions is the position of the feet. To adopt the right guard, you keep the left foot in front and vice versa. The sword is always held above the head, pointing approximately 45 degrees backwards. The fencer should be able to see his opponent under his pommel. Alba is more or less the ending position of a straight blow from above. Translated, it means fool. This guard is often used to provoke an opponent to attack the head. In the right Alba, the left foot is in front and the sword is held straight downwards in front of the body. On some occasions, the point can touch the ground. In the left Alba, the right foot is in front. The sword is held in the same position. The German word ox has the same meaning as the English one. This guard is threatening with a thrust, but it's also easy to deliver a strike with a simple turn of the sword. In the right version of this guard, the left foot is kept forward, and the sword is held with the hilt high and in front of the head, and the point directed to the opponent's face. The cross guard is more or less horizontal. This is the left ox. Again, the cross is held high and in front to cover the head, and the point is threatening the opponent. This is a detail of the very important thumb grip. Flug, translated, means plough. It threatens a thrust from below. To assume a right flug, keep your left leg in front and hold your sword at your right hip with the point directed towards the opponent's face. The right thumb is on the inside flat of the blade and the long edge is oriented downwards. The left flug is exactly the opposite. Now the long edge is oriented upwards. Here the grip position is detailed again. Schrankhut can either be translated into barrier guard or crossed guard. We prefer to use barrier guard because it closes off one opening completely and forces the opponent to attack another one. It's the beginning and ending point of a Krummfau. In the right Schrankhut, the left foot is in front and the sword is held with the point on the ground on the right front. The thumb is on the flat and the true edge faces right. In the left Schrankhut, the right foot is in front, the arms are crossed, and the point is on the ground in the left front. The blade is oriented with the short edge to the left. Langort simply means long point. In fact, it's the end of a straight thrust, but can also be used on its own to keep an opponent at distance. In right langort, the sword is extended towards the opponent and the left foot is in front. The left langort only differs in the position of the feet. Try to identify the different guards. Did you manage it? You see, the guards are very important. This is a free flow through the guards. It's a preliminary stage of Spiegelfechten or mirror fencing, which is a kind of shadow boxing with the sword. Now the same exercise a little faster. If you take a closer look, you'll see strikes developing by changing between the guards. Once again, try to identify the different guards. They're very important. We've already shown you basic striking information in the general basics section. Now we'd like to show you how the important strikes, the diagonal ones, are carried out. They're not carried through, but end in a position called hanger. The point literally hanging to the target represents a threat to the opponent. Here we see a right Oberhau, or stroke from above, being carried out. All strokes of this kind end in a hanger position. You can also recognize a further long sword principle here. All strokes are carried out with passing footwork, meaning, for instance, that a right Oberhau is completed with a step forward with the right foot. In this scene, you can clearly see what happens when a stroke is not stopped but pulled through. Now we see a left Oberhau, which once again ends in a hanger position. The right Unterhau, or stroke from below. The final position in this case is an upper hanger position. And now the left Unterhau, which ends in a right-hand upper hanger position. The next exercise comes from a fencing book written by Joachim Meyer. It can be done on your own or together with a partner as a target. It consists of 4 individual combinations which can be combined with one another. The first part begins with a right Oberhau, followed by a left and a right Unterhau, and completed by a left Oberhau. Then the 4 cuts are shown in a fluid exercise form. The first part is made up of a right Oberhau, a left and a right Unterhau, and finally a left Oberhau. Now an attack on an opening on the lower left-hand side of the opponent, followed by a right upper opening, a left upper opening, and finally a lower right-hand opening. Now a left Oberhau, followed by a right and left Unterhau, ending up with a right Oberhau. The final combination consists of a left Unterhau, a right and left Oberhau, and is completed with a right Unterhau. Then the 4 cuts are shown in a fluid exercise form. The ability to carry out these exercises properly is an important prerequisite for being able to do other exercises dealt with in other chapters. Just like basic strokes, the basic thrusts done with a long sword are divided up into the Oberstich and Unterstich, meaning upper and lower thrusts. A combination of the right and left Oberstich. The person carrying out the exercise begins with the upper hanger position and thrusts with his sword to the front. The body and legs follow in a fluid fashion. Even though a simple step is used, thrusts can also be combined with other footwork. An Unterstich, as the name suggests, is carried out from a lower hanger position. Just like in the case of the Oberstich, the movement is begun with the sword and the body follows. The 4 thrusts can be practiced in the same kind of combination as the strokes. One begins with the right Oberstich, then the left and right Unterstich, and finally the left Oberstich. The other combinations are done in the same order as the exercises for strokes. The Zornhau, or strike of wrath, is a diagonal Oberhau, or stroke from above, which ends in a hanger position. In this case, a right Zornhau is used to attack an opponent using a vom Tag auf der Schulter position. Here it's important to retain his line and prevent his opponent from countering. The Zornhau is used with a double step. In this case, we demonstrate the same technique from the left-hand side against an opponent with a Tag auf der Schulter on the left-hand side. Should an opponent attack using a right Oberhau, the partner defending moves to the side with a double step and uses a Zornhau against his opponent's blade. He immediately thrusts down towards his opponent's face. It's especially important that the Zornhau is stopped in a position that threatens the face of the opponent. Should an attack take place using a left Oberhau, then the defense should be a mirror image of the first case. The drill shown here is excellent practice for a Zornhau from left or right and also offers an amount of reaction training. Both partners begin in a vom Tag über den Kopf position. The Krumpfhau, or crooked strike, is a diagonal downward stroke from one's right side to an opponent's right side. A thumb grip is used for a diagonal or spiral-shaped blow to the front, which ends in the Schrankhut or barrier guard position. In this case, the Krumpfhau is used to attack an opponent using a left ox primary guard. The strike is directed against the opponent's hands. Now we see the same technique used against an opponent in a right ox primary guard position. Notice here that the short edge or kurze Schneide is used. This detailed film shot clearly shows the thumb grip used in the final stage of the stroke. Naturally, the Krumpfhau can also be utilized to counter an Oberhau. Here, a certain amount of feeling for the correct distance is especially important. The footwork is directed diagonally to the rear in order to remain outside the opponent's reach. The Krumpfhau is an extremely versatile stroke. It's also useful to counter an Unterhau. Here we see a Krumpfhau used against the flat of an opponent's sword. It knocks the opponent's weapon downwards so that an attack using the short or back edge of the blade is made possible. The movements in this special example lead from the guard vom Tag via the Schrankhut to the Flug or plough position. This is the same technique used on the other side. The opposing attacker uses the long edge of the blade. The use of the Krumpfhau to the flat against a right Unterhau is also a possibility. This practice drill helps to achieve a fluid use of the Krumpfhau stroke on both sides. The partner attacks 3 times, alternating right and left with an Oberhau or an Unterhau. The defender then retaliates with a Krumpfhau in each case. Those who own good protective armor can also use this practice drill to try the Krumpfhau against his opponent's hands. Now the whole thing again in slow motion. The Schwächhau or thwart stroke is a horizontal stroke that's used in combination with the thumb grip in order to counter and protect against an attack from above. The final position of the Schwächhau is the ox primary guard position. In this scene we see a Schwächhau used from the right against an opponent standing in a vom Tag over the head position. The attacker begins with a vom Tag on the shoulder and winds the blade into the ox position with the aid of the thumb along the blade, while moving slightly to the side or forward at the same time. In doing so, he used the short or back edge to hit the left-hand side of his opponent's head. In the final position, the hilt of the sword serves to protect the attacker's head. In the case of a Schwächhau used from the left against a vom Tag over the head position, the long edge of the blade makes contact. Carrying out the Schwächhau requires the hilt of the sword to be held high in front of one's head in order to protect one's hands from contact with the opponent's blade. Should an opponent attack using a straight Oberhau to the head, then a Schwächhau from the right can be used. Ideally, the opponent is struck at the same time. It's often more advantageous to advance directly towards your opponent without trying to move away to the side. In this case, the ability to hit simultaneously is made more difficult, but the position of your blade offers more protection. It's also easier to adopt further techniques. This film scene illustrates what happens when the hands are held too low when using a Schwächhau. Both hands and the head can be hit. Should the person under attack be in a left vom Tag on the shoulder position, then it's better to use a Schwächhau from the left, but the principle remains the same. In this drill, a student can learn how to use high and low Schwächhau strokes in a fluid way from left and right. The defender in this case plays the target and only parries the opponent's strokes with the strong of his sword. The Schielhau, or squinting strike, is a diagonal or vertical Oberhau which utilizes the thumb grip to achieve a better line than a normal Oberhau. The Schielhau ends in a kind of stretched-out Flug primary guard. In this case, we see a Schielhau being used against a right Flug primary guard. Both of the opponents have their left feet forward. The aggressor attacks with a diagonal Oberhau using a thumb grip and manages to hit his opponent's head on the left side with the short or back edge. At the same time, the line is closed so that the opponent's sword is pushed away from the danger zone. In this way, a possible thrust can be avoided. The final position much resembles a stretched-out left Flug. Now we have the same technique from the left to attack an opponent using a left Flug primary guard. This is carried out with a long or front edge, and once again a thumb grip is employed. This version doesn't apparently come up in the training manuals, but we decided to include the technique employed from both sides anyway. The Schielhau can be also used against a right diagonal Oberhau. If the person being attacked is in a von Tag on the shoulder position, a Schielhau from the right can land on the left side of the opponent's head. Here we have the left side variation, which ends up in a kind of stretched right Flug position. Should the initial position be vom Tag over the head, the stroke is carried out in a vertical way towards the shoulder, from which the attack was started. So a right Oberhau hits the right shoulder of the opponent and the other way around. The sword must be guided towards the side once again so that the line remains closed. Should the opponent be in a Langort or long point position, a Schielhau stroke can be launched against the blade without taking a step, and then slid along it towards the chest or face of the opponent. The Scheitelhau or scalp cut is a straight stroke from above which can be used to attack the head of the opponent using its increased reach. The Scheitelhau or scalp cut is effective against the Alba or Fool, which is one of the 4 primary guards in the Lichtenauer longsword system. It doesn't matter which side the stroke is carried out on. The important thing is to keep one's hands held high in order to gain maximum reach. The use of a Scheitelhau against a cut to the legs tends to support the Überlaufen or overrunning principle. This principle maintains that strokes towards the upper part of the body possess a longer reach than cuts directed at the lower parts of the body. For this reason, low blows don't need to be directly countered. Once a little distance has been achieved, a fresh initiative may be launched by counter-striking simultaneously. The Überlaufen drill. This trains defensive tactics against high and low attacks. The aggressor either attacks with a diagonal Oberhau towards the head or a Mittelhau or middle stroke directed towards the legs. The defender has to take the decision about which technique is the right one. This drill can naturally be staged from the left, or attacks may be carried out from both sides. The term versetzen has several meanings. In the manuals interpreted in this work, it's used to describe the action of countering the guards with the master cuts. The basic techniques have already been shown in the section on the master cuts. Here you see a drill where player 1 shifts through the guards. Every now and then he stops in one guard. This is the cue for player 2 to attack with the appropriate master cut. Ansetzen, or attacking with the point, is used when an opponent raises his sword to begin a stroke and a thrust is carried out by the other partner. The attacker is in a right fluke position and is thus exposing his left side. When the opponent draws back his weapon to launch a blow, the movement is followed by a thrust towards the upper left opening. Should the opponent draw back his sword to carry out an Unterhau, then a thrust towards the lower left-hand opening is carried out. In this case, the attacker is in a left fluke position. Should his opponent begin to prepare a left Oberhau stroke, then the attacker launches a thrust in the direction of the upper right-hand target area. Should the attacker move towards staging a left Unterhau, then a thrust is directed towards the lower right-hand area. Absetzen means to deflect an opponent's attack by winding into an Ochs or Flug and, in the same movement, countering with a thrust. In modern fencing terminology, this would be a counter-thrust with opposition. The defender begins in a right Flug. As the opponent attacks the left upper opening with a strike or a thrust, he winds the hilt into the position of left Ochs, and, in one continuous motion, thrusts the attacker's face while taking a step to the front. Here, the same technique from another camera angle and without a partner. If the attack is directed to the right upper opening, the technique is carried out exactly in the opposite way. If the opponent attacks the left lower opening, the defender simply has to wind into a left Flug and from there to thrust with a step using the right foot. Against an attack to the right lower opening, the appropriate defense is to wind into a right Flug and immediately thrust with a step by the left foot. Absetzen can be applied from many different guards. Here you see an example from a Langort. If the opponent attacks with an Oberhau to the left upper opening, the defender winds into a left Ochs and thrusts the face or breast of the attacker. With this exercise, one can train to defend with Absetzen while simultaneously obtaining a better sense of balance. The defender is standing with both feet together and the legs slightly bent. The opposing partner attacks left or right, either with an Oberhau or an Unterhau, while the defender defends with Absetzen. The counter thrust is left out to keep the flow of the exercise. The term nachreisen translated means something like travelling after somebody. You first evade the opponent's attack, mostly an Oberhau, and follow up with your own blow in the same direction. If your opponent strikes a right diagonal Oberhau, you take evasive action backwards just enough to let his blow miss the target. Then you counter immediately with your own left diagonal Oberhau. If the attack is made with a left Oberhau, you evade again and counter with a right Oberhau. It's important that your counter follows the direction of the opponent's blow. Zucken means pulling and is applied to techniques where you pull back your sword to thrust on the other side of the opponent's blade. The attacker starts a diagonal Oberhau. If the opponent tries to displace with his sword to the side, without threatening with a point, he pulls back his sword before blade contact and thrusts to the other side. And now the same technique from the other side. Even if a bind occurs against your weak, you can execute what is known as Zucken. Since you are badly covered while executing this technique, it's advisable to apply it only if the opponent's sword is held far to the side. This drill is used to train yourself to apply the Zucken technique at the right time. The partner taking the lead always attacks with a diagonal Oberhau. The partner defends by binding against the weak, either pushing forwards or sideways. If the pressure is in a forward direction, you remain in the bind. If the pressure is sideways, you apply the Zucken technique. In Durchwechseln, or changing through, you begin with an Oberhau. If the opponent tries to displace the blow without threatening with the point, you let your point sink down under the opponent's sword to thrust on the other side. Most of the times, Durchwechseln is done before a bind occurs. Nevertheless, it can also be done from a bind. You attack with a right diagonal Oberhau. The opponent tries to displace the blow in the beginning phase. Thereupon, you lift your hands to the left and simultaneously let your point sink down. Doing this, the point naturally changes through to the other side of the opponent's blade. You are now in a position similar to ox. From there, you thrust towards the opening. The same technique can be applied on the left side. It's a bit more uncomfortable to execute, though, because of the hands getting crossed during the movement. If you're in Langort and the opponent tries to strike your sword aside with an Oberhau, you again lift your hands and let your point sink down. As soon as the blow has passed your blade, you immediately thrust from an ox position with a step forward. Here you see the consequences of changing through when the opponent is defending to the front. In this exercise, you always attack with a diagonal Oberhau. Your partner displaces against your weak with pressure sideways, or the middle of your blade with forward pressure. If he defends with forward pressure, you simply stay in the bind. If he pushes to the side, you change through and thrust to the other side. It's very important that your partner applies the pressure in a clear manner in order to help you make the right decision. The principle of Überlaufen has already been described in the section on the Scheitelhau. This exercise is an extension of the drill shown there. The attacker now has the option to attack high or low on both sides. Durchlaufen, or running through, is a series of techniques out of the bind strong against strong. It's generally used to begin wrestling. Out of a right diagonal Oberhau, we happen to be in a bind strong against strong. If the opponent's pressure is towards us, we slightly lift our sword and release the pommel with our left hand. If the opponent bends a little forward, we step with our left foot to his front while wrapping the left arm around his torso. We then throw him over the left hip. This can also be applied out of a left diagonal Oberhau. In this case, the left hand stays on the pommel and the right one is released. Then the right foot steps in front of the opponent to throw him over the right hip with the right arm at his back. Now we have the same situation as before. We started out of the right Oberhau and got into a bind, but the opponent is leaning backwards a little bit. Now we release the right hand and step with the right leg behind the opponent to throw him backwards with the aid of our right hand. The same can be done with the left Oberhau. Now the left hand is released and the technique is done like a mirror image of the previous one. This is another application of the Durchlaufen. It only works with the right Oberhau. The left hand releases the pommel and the grip is hooked behind the opponent's wrist. Then the left hand grabs the right elbow of the opponent and presses upwards and then forwards. You are thus able to control him or throw him with a step undertaken with the left foot. If in the same situation the opponent is bending his arm, you reach behind his elbow with your left hand and grab your own arm. Thus you establish a figure 4 lock and can throw him backwards. This technique, like the last example, can also only be done on one side. Another technique out of the same situation is the shearer or scissors. The left hand releases the hilt of the sword. Then you put the grip behind the opponent's right arm. The left hand then blocks the grip on the other side. The aim is to produce a painful grip with the help of leverage, and the opponent is forced to the floor. The technique Schnitt, or cut in the old manuals, has more than one meaning. Now we're going to demonstrate the variant that is also called Händrücken, or pressing the hands. With this, you control the opponent's arms through constant pressure using the strong of your sword. If out of a bind on the left side, or otherwise close distance, the opponent pulls back his sword upwards or to his right shoulder, you quickly shorten the distance and press the opponent's arms towards him with the strong of your sword. The point is directed to the right. If the Schnitt is done in the thumb grip, as demonstrated here, the short edge is used to control the arms. This is the lower Schnitt. If, out of a bind on the right, the opponent pulls back upwards or to his left shoulder, the Schnitt is done with the point to the left. If the opponent lowers his arms out of the bind or misses and ends up in a low position, we use the upper Schnitt. It's mostly done using the standard grip, but can also be applied in the thumb grip. Again, it can be done on both sides. The most common use of the upper Schnitt will be shown in the chapter dealing with examples of practical application. While using Schnitt or Händrücken, it's very important to constantly maintain forward pressure in order to keep the opponent under control. You also have to be able to adapt to the opponent's movement. Here, for example, you can see how the lower Schnitt is turned into an upper one by following the opponent's pressure. At the end, you are perfectly aligned for a thrust. The vier Hängen, or hangers, are synonymous with the Flug and the Ochs from both sides. It doesn't matter if the sword is held in the standard grip or the thumb grip. The term derives from the point of the sword hanging towards the opponent's opening. First, the four Hängen in the thumb grip. The positions taken correspond exactly with the guards Ochs and Flug. The pressure with the point against the pad is used to clarify the threatening of the openings. Now, the vier Hängen in the standard grip. The basic principle remains the same. Winding is one of the core elements of the Lichtenauer system of fencing. Basically, in the bind, you always align your sword so that the point is threatening your opponent. To achieve this, you wind your sword against or around your opponent's sword, depending on the pressure the opponent is imposing on you. If you look closely, many of the previous techniques are just variations of the winding. We're only going to demonstrate the most basic examples of winding. Through diligent practice, you will eventually be able to recognize the connections and to develop the other variations by yourself. Out of a simultaneous right Oberhau, you came into a bind strong against strong. If the opponent's pressure is towards you, you wind your sword against his blade into left Ochs. Thus you gain control of his blade and thrust into his face. If the opponent's pressure is going to the side, you wind around his sword into right Ochs and again thrust to his face. According to Lichtenauer, every winding can be done with a thrust, a strike, or a cut. These variations were called the three woundings. Here you can see a winding finished with a thrust. The same winding combined with a strike, in this case a Schwerschau. Again the same winding, this time ending in a cut to the opponent's neck. The continuous winding drill shows the 8 possibilities of winding and combines them into a simple exercise. If you've mastered this exercise, you should free yourself from the pattern and react freely to the pressure of the opponent. Beginning with the Zornhau thrust, the opponent pushes the thrust aside at your strong. You wind into right ox, continuing with the face thrust into the left upper opening. If the opponent defends this again, you let your point sink down and thrust into the left lower opening. If the opponent stays in the bind and again manages to defend, you change into the left fluke position and thrust to the right lower opening. If he continues to follow your sword, you wind upwards into left ox and thrust to his right upper opening. If he again displaces this, you wind around his sword into right ox, and so on. Here you can see the whole exercise flowing together. If the drill is done out of a left Oberhau, you simply wind counterclockwise. The flow of the technique stays the same. Abnehmen is used when the opponent puts sideways pressure against the weak of our sword with his blade upright. The deflection of the opponent's diagonal Oberhau with a Zornhau is followed by a thrust to his face. The opponent defends by pushing with his upright sword against the weak of your sword. You counter this by lifting your sword upwards over the opponent's tip and then striking to his head on the other side of the opposing sword. The same technique from the left. You should pay special attention to lift your sword only so high that it just passes the opponent's point. Duplieren means to double a strike. You attack with a strike that is blocked sideways against the strong. Then you strike again behind the opponent's blade. If the opponent presses your Oberhau to the side with his strong against yours, you wind around his blade and strike again, but this time to the other side of the head. The same technique from the other side. Here it's possible to use the long or the short edge as well. Mutieren is a special form of counterwinding which attacks the lower opening. Out of a right Oberhau, you happen to be in a bind strong against strong with the pressure to you. To reply to this, you wind into left ox and thrust behind the opponent's sword into the lower opening. Modern fencers might notice that this technique is similar to the Quadflank-Grenade. Mutieren out of a left Oberhau. Again, you take control of the opponent's weak with your strong and thrust into the lower opening. Schnappen, or snapping, is a possibility to free your sword when the opponent presses downwards at your strong. If you bind strong against strong, and the opponent presses downwards, you yield to the force and wind the pommel over his sword and snap to the head. The ending position is similar to Flug. If the technique is done on the right side, you have to use the long edge. If it's done on the left, simply use the short one. Here are some examples of how to apply the aforementioned techniques according to the bind and the pressure the opponent uses. First, a bind strong against strong with forward pressure. Wind into ox against the opponent's blade to control its weak with your strong and thrust to the face or towards the lower opening. Again the same bind with downward pressure. Wind your pommel over the opponent's hilt and snap to his face with the long edge. Our worst-case scenario happens when our weak is against the opponent's strong, and he presses forward. The only possibility to escape is to change the strong-weak relationship. For example, through winding quickly into ox, you bring your strong back to his weak. If the opponent pushes to the side with an angled blade, a good response is to change through with a thrust to the other side. If the bind happens to be with your strong against the opponent's weak and your point is directed towards him, you directly thrust into his opening. However, if you react wrongly with strong pressure to the side, your opponent can take advantage of this and hit around with a Schwächau. This again can be countered by a Schnitt onto his arms. This is a basic striking exercise that teaches the above-mentioned angles of attack in a fixed sequence. You can strike a right diagonal Oberhau and then a left Unterhau. Then a right Unterhau and a left Oberhau. Afterwards, a right Mittelhau followed by a left Mittelhau. You conclude with a straight Oberhau and a straight Unterhau. The same sequence can be done with the Messer or one-handed sword. This time, the exercise is being carried out with sword and buckler. And then the same exercise with a staff. When the strike exercise shown here is carried out with a rapier or riding sword, the footwork changes, but the direction of strikes remains the same. The 4 thrusts can be practiced in the same kind of combination as the strokes. One begins with the right Oberstich, then the left and right Unterstich, and finally the left Oberstich. Once again, this sequence can also be done using all possible weapons. Here, for instance, we see it being done with a one-handed sword. This time, the exercise is being carried out with sword and buckler. And then with a staff. And now with a rapier or riding sword.